Board materials tell a polished story, but is it the true one? Today, we're digging into the gap between what directors see on paper and what's actually happening inside the organization, especially when it comes to leadership. My next guest, Suzan Morno-Wade, Director and Compensation Committee Chair of Latham Pool Products Inc. and Director and Compensation and Leadership Development Chair of Veritiv Holdings, makes the case that boards are routinely surprised by succession gaps because they're evaluating talent through the wrong lens, and that the CHRO may be an underused key to closing that gap. So how do directors get past the presentation and find out whether they really have the leaders they'll need 3 to 5 years from now? Suzan, boards spend enormous time discussing CEO succession and talent, but much of what directors see comes through formal presentations and board materials. How can directors gain a more honest view of leadership strength and organizational health, and what role should the CHRO play in providing that perspective?
I am very fortunate to have sat in both seats, right? As a former CHRO and now a board member, comp committee chair. So I can look for patterns, and I see patterns as it relates to this topic. And for me, I agree with you. Boards do spend an enormous amount of time discussing succession, but I sometimes feel like it is through an old lens, the same sort of playbook. And what I mean is, succession's moving faster than any organization could ever absorb. I think I read and heard a stat that the CEO tenure is now on average about 4.7 years. Maybe you guys know that exactly, but I think it's about 4.7 years. So, while boards are routinely looking at financial, M&A, and operational analysis, and they're doing so with a lot of rigor, they don't always look at the human capital analysis in the same way. And so, second part to your question about the role of CHRO, I think the CHRO's role is really to help orchestrate what the board needs, to give them what I think is like this holistic view of readiness across the organization. Because the CHRO is an individual who has probably the most unique role in that they see the entire system from end to end. And so they can be quite impactful and useful in that discussion with the board around readiness, because they're doing so with data and evidence. So I think the CHRO is a trusted voice to the board at the end of the day in this process.
Companies often outgrow the leadership capabilities that got them to their current stage. What are the signs that a CEO is successfully evolving alongside the business? And what are the warning signs that leadership development is not keeping pace with the company's strategic demands?
For me, I think signs that a CEO is evolving with the business. Let's use, for example, if a CEO has transitioned from his or her operator role, right? So they've had responsibility for a business unit or function. The sign that I'd be looking for is whether they're now thinking as an enterprise leader. They're now comfortable to shape the business versus running it. They're more comfortable letting their team make decisions rather than having all the decisions themselves. I also am passionate about learning, and I think a CEO has to exhibit high learning agility more in that role than ever before, because less information comes to them. So they have to seek to learn, they have to seek perspective from others, and they have to engage outside as well as inside. I think a couple more things for me. I think one of the other things I'd be looking for, whether the CEO is prioritizing building a strong team, is so that they can move faster. And so eliminating, removing underperformers. And then probably the last one for me that I look for is the relationship with the board. So do they see the value in the board? Are they trying to build a relationship with the board, one that's transparent and honest, and where they can leverage the skills of the board and use them as a sounding council or sounding board. And so, when I think about, um, sort of warning signs, I guess, it's really all of those in the reverse, right? Or the opposite. So, not able to build a high performing team, really puts the board off, becomes very insular in their thinking and their interactions, and, probably not even having good self awareness that is necessary. And, for me, that's a bit, controversial at the end of the day is, CEO who's incapable of really leveraging those resources around them to be able to make strong decisions at the end of the day.
Many boards review succession plans regularly, yet leadership gaps still surprise them. What do directors most often miss when evaluating the executive pipeline, and how can boards determine whether they truly have the talent needed to evaluate strategy over the next 3 to 5 years?
Probably I'll start with honest conversation, Bill. I think that is one of the things that's missing. You've got management who may have one agenda. You may have the board that has a different, and they're not necessarily aligned. So the management may want to put names on a list. The board perhaps doesn't know those individuals, or think that maybe the management team is developing the successors in the way that they should. And so that could contribute to that. So this honest conversation and assessment of people. And I also think we tend sometimes as humans to focus on what's needed today versus the capabilities that are needed tomorrow. And this is a conversation I'm very passionate about, and that we have to be thinking about talent that's needed to scale the business. We need leadership capacity that can grow with the business. And sometimes the business gets more complex as it grows. And so boards need to be able to determine whether they have the talent that can scale with a growing organization.
Directors often say talent is their most important asset, but many boards spend more time reviewing financial results than leadership quality. What governance practices separate boards that truly understand their leadership bench from those that simply assume it's strong?
Yeah, it really is a sad fact that that is the case. And I think that leadership capabilities is a critical equation in value creation. And boards do routinely see rigorous, financial, operational, M&A analysis, as I was saying earlier, but maybe don't see human capital in the same way. And so that has the negative effect of undervaluing things like succession. When that is so critical to growth, transformation, to deals, integration, et cetera. And so, some of the good governance practices that I have found to be successful, one is embedding, aligning succession discussions with the strategic business reviews and strategic business discussion. Absolutely. They cannot be separate from one another. The succession, the talent, the succession discussion enables the business to be able to perform, to grow, and obviously drive value. I think holding regular sessions with the board to pressure test those assumptions, leadership decisions, and your readiness. And every organization needs to decide what that is. If that's quarterly, semi-annually, whatever the case may be, but pressure testing that along the way. I think this regular review is part of what is needed for the board to stay close to the organization and manage risk. I also like for the board to do external benchmarking, the board and the management teams do external benchmarking, because that brings that outside perspective in as you start comparing your, internal talent to what's outside. I do also like the idea of putting people in certain situations to test them. Because one of the things I always wonder when you have a high potential and you've seen them perform in a certain environment, you always wonder if you take them out of that environment, can they do as well somewhere else? And so if you have the ability to put these high potential successors, in different situations, then you can understand how they handle them. I think that's another. And then I think finally, one that I find quite valuable, and I certainly advocated when I was in my operating role and that I practice in my board role, is this idea of walking around and spending time with people outside of the boardroom. So get to know, spend meaningful time with people outside of the boardroom. And you learn a lot about the business. You learn a lot about individuals, how they're thinking and how they approach situations. And I find that that gives you a much different perspective than the sort of canned or prepared presentations and interactions that you have in the boardroom.